Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments we're covering this week. What's driving the story in Brazil? Is it corruption, or is it the media there? An editor and a blogger killed in Bangladesh. Another blogger says he's facing death threats. From social media to mobile messaging, how news, rumors, and government propaganda are now coming straight to your phone. And all the cliches of the campaign trail, the political ad deconstructed. Audiences around the world have seen the images from the streets of Brazil. Millions of demonstrators for and against the president in dozens of cities in the biggest political protests in the country's history. But what is the real story? Is it really about corruption and the rampant money laundering of those involved in the Petrobras scandal? Because if it is, then how is the main opposition party, many of whose own members have been implicated, in a position to impeach President Dilma Rousseff? Or is this the story of an out-and-out political power struggle? And how much of it is being driven by Brazilian media barons who are conservative and whose ideological hostility to Rousseff's Workers' Party, the PT, is no secret? Brazil's most influential broadcast and print outlets like Globo, Abril, and Folha are media powerhouses owned by a handful of the country's richest families. Those outlets have been called out for their selective and strategic coverage of this impeachment story. And they've been accused of trying to use the corruption scandal to unseat a government that 50 million Brazilians voted for less than 2 years ago. In an attempt to change the narrative, President Rousseff held a private media briefing with journalists from major international outlets, letting them know that there's more to this story and its coverage than meets the eye. But with Parliament already having voted to impeach her and the bulk of domestic media coverage still working against her, the president has a huge mountain to climb. Our starting point this week is the capital, Brasilia. Beginning with what this story is not. It is not, as some defenders of the Rousseff government argue, a mere media conspiracy. Right-wing oligarchs trying to bring down a leftist government. The Petrobras scandal is on a scale unlike anything Brazil has ever seen. $1.7 billion worth of bribes paid that we know about. 179 people charged, 93 convictions, adding up to sentences totaling nearly 1,000 years of jail time. The Petrobras story, combined with a tanking economy and further allegations against President Rousseff over cooking the budgetary books before her re-election in 2014, all created a cumulative effect, leading to the lower house of Parliament voting to impeach her.
There's huge discontent in Brazil. The idea that the people are coming in the streets to protest just because the media is telling them to do so, and this is all fabricated, this is neither true. There are factual reasons why people are discontent in Brazil. The unemployment is very high. The inflation is very high. Yes, there is a conspiracy, but there is basis for that conspiracy.
Nós estamos vivendo a maior crise política.
We're living through the biggest political crisis of the last 25 years. A complex and deep investigation with lots of breaking news about big companies and important political characters, as well as a strong economic depression. It has culminated in the impeachment process that was approved in Congress and is now waiting to be approved by the Senate.
That impeachment vote, which took place 2 weeks ago, was a marathon piece of political theater broadcast on screens big and small across the country. More than 150 elected deputies have been implicated in the Petrobras scandal, and most of them voted to impeach a president who hasn't been implicated. And they performed for the cameras that they knew were watching, many dedicating their yes votes to figures and causes that would resonate with Brazilians.
Por Deus, por minha família, pelas famílias, pelas pessoas de bem, meu voto é sim, fora Dilma, fora Lula, fora PT!
The entire process lasted more than 8 hours, and some Brazilian broadcast live in its entirety.
Most of the mainstream media, as you know, is pro-impeachment. So that gives you a clear idea where they're coming from.
A gente vai de novo lá para a Câmara.
So having 8 hours of a spectacle is the best that they can get. It is a frightening discourse that was there.
O Brasil, sim para o futuro!
The media is a very important social actor in Brazil, there is no doubt, and especially in crisis times.
In Brazil, you have a
mainstream media that tends to the right of the political spectrum. The first big protest in March of last year, O Globo newspaper, its cover said, "Brazil has a new 15th of March." The last famous 15th of March was in 1985, the day the military regime handed power back to civilian leaders. So they're framing a pro-impeachment march as somehow equivalent to the end of 21 years of dictatorship. That reveals clear political bias.
Accusations of media bias in Brazil inevitably start with Globo, the biggest media conglomerate in Latin America. In 2014, The Economist called Globo Brazil's most powerful company, and it wasn't just talking about the media sector. Globo owns or is affiliated with 340 media outlets, 122 of them television channels, the rest in print, radio, or online. Its nightly national newscast, Jornal Nacional, is watched by more than 90 million people. No other broadcast comes close in ratings or influence. And Globo has a history of conservative politics trumping its journalism, notably its support of Brazil's military dictatorship between 1964 and 1985. In 2013, almost 3 decades after democracy was restored, Globo finally issued an apology for failing its audiences during that period.
E há também o reconhecimento de erros, como o apoio editorial ao golpe militar de 1964.
Reporters Without Borders ranks countries annually on freedom of the press. In 2010, it had Brazil at 58th. This year, it is down to 104th. The NGO cited concentrated ownership in the hands of a few leading families, and on this story said the media have urged the public to bring down the president. Globo is owned by the Mourinho family, which defended the company in the pages of the UK's Guardian newspaper. The Brazilian press and the Globo Group fulfilled their duty to inform about everything, wrote João Mourinho, as would have been the case in any other democracy. But when Globo's news outlets or other news organizations in Brazil report on politics, many are suspicious of the journalism and mindful of the history.
Nowadays, because you don't have the shrewd military coup, you have this traditional institutional mechanism to get rid of the opponent. And in that process, you have to legitimize it. And that is what the Brazilian media is doing, is legitimizing what we have to call it by its name, is a coup in slow motion.
Eu entendo que o PT e o governo
I understand that the Workers' Party needs a narrative, and the only way that they have found they can survive is by creating a narrative that they are the victims of a political coup, and that the press has played a part in this. But the fact remains that the impeachment process is following constitutional requirements. So to talk about a coup does not make sense. A coup implies that the rules have been broken, and this is not the case.
On the last piece that it was produced by Al Jazeera about Brazil, there was a Globe reporter, and his last phrase was, "We are balanced, our news are balanced."
Mesmo que você identifique alguma tendência em veículo ou outro, ela nunca será por omissão de ouvir os lados.
I kind of stopped the video there and I said, how on earth can you say this to a public communication media? You're not being ethical.
Between the argument that Global and these other news organizations are just coldly, neutrally reporting on the facts, on the one hand, which is clearly not true, and that they are in league to overthrow the government, on the other hand, is an enormous distance, and the truth is in the middle of that.
There are some Brazilian news outlets that bring something different to the table. Mídia Ninja is a collective of citizen journalists that got its start in 2013 during the first wave of protests against Rousseff's government. It now has more than 630,000 followers on Facebook and publishes in 7 languages. The name Ninja is a Portuguese language acronym for Independent Narratives, Journalism, and Action. Agência Pública is a non-profit investigative journalism organization based in Sao Paulo whose reporting is often republished by other outlets, including Al Jazeera. It belongs to the public, and its stories often look at the defense of human rights or violence by agents of the state. Publica practices transparency. Its website includes details on how it's funded and who its partners are. Then there's Fluxo, created in 2014 by Bruno Tortura, who prior to that had set up Media Ninja. Operating mostly from Sao Paulo, Fluxo is about long-form reportage, whether it's video, audio, or text. It relies on its audience for news stories as well as its funding.